All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Science on the Sound at the Coastal Studies Institute on the East Carolina University Outer Banks Campus. Today, you will be hearing from a group of students that have been studying here, hosted at CSI for the semester. They are from the UNC-Chapel Hill Institute for the Environment's Outer Banks field site. The students are about to tell you about an impressive research project that they did this semester as a group, and that research project is called the Capstone. My name is Lindsay Dubbs. I am the director of the Outer Banks field site, and together with Associate Director Dr. Linda Dana, and this year, Dr. Sean Charles, who is a research assistant professor here at Coastal Studies Institute, we mentored the students through this project this year. Thank you to our community advisory board members who also played a really important role in this research project this year by advising the students, giving them feedback throughout the year on the project and how to present it. And also providing them with experiences that the faculty couldn't offer them, taking them surfing, showing them around different places, giving them totally different perspectives than we were able to as a faculty. So thank you to our community advisory board members. We have a couple of them here in the room, and we also, I think, have some online. This semester, the success of our Capstone Research Project really also hinged upon a collaboration with the team at the Donald C. O'Brien Pine Island Audubon Sanctuary. We've been talking with Robbie Fern and Kat Bowler there for years, trying to figure out how to do a project with them. And we're thrilled that this year it actually came to fruition. Robbie and Sarah Marshhauser hosted us for extended periods of time at the Pine Island Sanctuary, and they also provided us with data, connections, and logistical support throughout the semester, so huge thanks to them. Those extended stays in the Currituck Sound region, I think, were really beneficial for these students. They had hands-on, in-depth experience in the region, witnessing its beauty firsthand, and really getting an idea of how unique and special a place it is. It also, I think, really helped fortify the connection among them, which is something that we always hope happens, and it certainly happened this semester. I think I can speak on behalf of the whole faculty in saying how proud we are of these students. They were so dedicated to this research and also to each other. They also were incredibly open to new experiences. So, as I said, they spent time in Currituck Sound region, but a lot of that time was actually spent in the marshes, wearing waders day after day. They also had an openness for talking with people through interviews, and that was after only weeks, if not days before, learning how to conduct an interview. So, awesome job, y'all. They worked really hard and on what you are about to see today, but they also worked really hard in all of their 3 classes, their seminar, their lab, and at their internships. I would like to remind everyone that though they conducted all of this research with rigor, this is foremost an educational experience. And the research that you're about to hear about today was conducted in just 4 months, whereas most research that you hear at these Science on the Sounds has been conducted for between 1 and 5 years. So please keep that in mind. I also would like to just give recognition to the community members who took the time to speak with our students through those interviews throughout the Capstone Research Project. obviously, this work really depended on their willingness to take the time to talk with them. And there were lots of other people and entities across the Outer Banks who made this experience special for our students. So thank you to all of those people. You'll see a slide at the end about that. Here at the Coastal Studies Institute, Director Corbett and the faculty and staff of CSI made this a very welcoming environment, a very enriching environment. So thank you to everyone here. And also to those at UNC-Chapel Hill who made this possible. The Study Abroad Office, Institute for the Environment, the Environment, Ecology, and Energy Program. They all provided the foundational support to allow this program to happen. So thank you. Thank you also to Lauren Curlin, our program assistant, and our resident advisor, Rebecca Ladauer. Thank you so much for helping the students throughout their semester. And thanks to John McCord for live streaming for us today. Thank you also to the internship mentors for sharing your time and expertise with these students and kind of giving them a glimpse of a real-world environmental research or law or policy job. And finally, I want to recognize the faculty of the Outer Banks field site. The students and I are really lucky to work with and learn from and with you. Dr. Dana taught the management class. Dr. Sean Charles was instrumental in lending his wetland expertise throughout the Capstone Research. Lee Leidy and two other practicing environmental attorneys in this region, John Everett and Mary Carson Stiff, helped to teach the law and policy class. And so we just would like to thank this community here at CSI, across the state of North Carolina, and across the Outer Banks for welcoming this program and helping to enrich the experience for the students. Just a few things that I ask of those of you who are in the room. Please make sure that your phones are silenced. And also, please hold your questions, comments, words of support, and job offers until the end of the presentation. We hope that you have lots of questions and things, but we would like for them to make it through the whole presentation first. Finally, if you'd like to learn anything else about the Outer Banks field site, please just Google OBXFS and you'll find us there. I am really almost done now. Thank you so much for your interest and support, also those online. And that makes me realize that I should also say that at the end of the presentation, when we do have a question period, please wait for me to bring you the mic so that those online can hear you. So thank you, and without any more delay, please join me in welcoming the Outer Banks Field Site class of 2024.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abby. I'm a senior from Hickory, North Carolina. I study environmental studies, and this semester I interned with the Nature Conservancy at the Nags Head Woods Preserve.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I'm a senior from Lakewood, Colorado. I'm studying political science and environmental studies, and this semester I interned with Wetlands Watch.
Hi all, my name's Caitlin. I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina. I'm a senior studying environmental studies and political science, and I interned with the National Estuarine Research Reserve.
Hey guys, I'm Veronica. I'm a sophomore from Cary, North Carolina. I'm studying environmental science, and this semester I interned at the North Carolina Audubon Pine Island Sanctuary.
Hi, I'm Lily. I'm a sophomore from Holly Springs, North Carolina, studying environmental science, and my internship this semester was here at CSI in one of the research labs.
Hi, I'm Jane, a senior from Kernersville, North Carolina, studying environmental studies and philosophy, and I interned at the North Carolina Coastal Federation.
Hi, I'm Carly. I'm a sophomore. I'm majoring in environmental studies, and I'm from Centennial, Colorado. And this semester, I interned with the North Carolina Aquarium's horticulture department.
Hey everyone, I'm Gloria. I'm a sophomore studying environmental science. I'm from Shanghai, China, and this semester I intern with the education department at the aquarium.
Hi, I'm Valeria. I'm a junior from Draper, Utah, outside of Salt Lake City. I'm majoring in economics and public policy, and I interned at the Atlantic Marine Energy Center.
Hi, I'm Addie. I'm from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I'm a current junior at UNC-Chapel Hill studying environmental studies. In this semester, I interned at the town of Duck.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I'm a junior from Salisbury, and I'm studying environmental studies and public policy. And this semester, I interned with the Nags Head Wood Nature Conservancy.
I'm Ella. I'm also a junior from Salisbury, North Carolina. I'm studying environmental studies and public policy, and I interned with the town of Nags Head. Thank you everyone for coming today, everyone online, thank you guys. Today we will be talking about our semester capstone project, which is titled The Sound of Change, Responses to Controlled Burns and Other Changes in the Currituck Sound. And this is us out in the marshes of the Currituck Sound, as Lindsay mentioned, and we're gonna tell you a little bit about the plants and the people and the overall makeup of this area. So for what we're gonna talk about today, we're gonna start you off with some background on the topic. We're going to go into what's the problem, why are we even studying this? And then we're going to break our research into two pathways. One, we're going to talk through the human dimension side, work through our methods and results, and then we're going to talk you through the natural science side. Lastly, we'll tie everything up together and conclude. So, as I said, this is us in the Currituck Sound. If you don't know, Currituck County is the northeasternmost county in North Carolina, right where that little star is. It's located 55 kilometers from Oregon Inlet, which is the closest inlet. This is pretty significant because though it is what we'll call a brackish marsh, which is this combination of salt and fresh water, it is really low saline because that inlet is so far away. So salt is one of the big things that's going to impact the plants and animals that live there, as well as the wind that gets in there. For some historical context to the area, it was originally inhabited by the Chowanog, Eopim, and Petitsky peoples who managed the area. In 1859, the Albemarle-Chesapeake Waterway opened, and this really allowed boats and a lot more people to start getting into the area, but because there were no major roads, it was still low development, low tourism, except for this boom of hunting and fishing with local people, and you had a lot of wealthy people from the North and New England area coming in and hunting. This allowed for the opening of a lot of hunt lodges. We stayed in the Pine Island Hunt Club, which opened in 1913 and was the first hunt club in Currituck County. Then we kind of shift gears in the 1960s and 70s with the creation of NC Highway 12, which is what we took to get to Currituck. And that allowed for this increase in tourism and development that was really happening in sort of the southern Outer Banks, but started to come into this region more. However, this new development, there was still a lot of areas that were protected. So in 1979, 3,000 acres of land was donated to the Audubon on the Currituck Sound. And in 2009, the Donald C. O'Brien Jr. Sanctuary and Audubon Center, where we stayed and studied, was established. And this is a picture from our visit to the Outer Banks Center for Wildlife Education, just showing how historically this area has really depended on the natural resources. And yeah, to talk a little bit more about that, we got to, as Lindsay mentioned, get really ingrained in the Currituck-Corolla area. So we traveled to downtown Corolla. We saw the lighthouse, which is obviously used for boating, for fishing. We saw the Outer Banks Center for Wildlife Education. We got to see some really cool, all across the area, waterfowl decoys that kind of showed both an art and a function. And this is an older picture of where we stayed, the Pine Island Lodge, and you can see so many waterfowl, which was really cool, and we really enjoyed seeing the birds in that area. And all of these things, these way people interact with the Currituck area, contributes to this idea of local ecological knowledge, which is different from this expert knowledge you may think of, where scientists and policymakers are coming in. This is just how everyday people who live and work in the area are interacting with the things there and how they use them and what they take out of it. So where we got to stay, like I mentioned, the NC Audubon. The North Carolina Audubon, this site was one of the first Audubon places in North Carolina. Like I said, this hunt lodge started in 1913. And while we may think of conservation, one of the main goals of the Audubon is sort of being this distinct from extractive uses, they really have a long history with hunting and fishing in the area and still continue to do this day. We can see the duck decoys in the house we stayed at, our little dining room, but it's also used for aesthetic. You can see us watching the sunset, there's kayaking. Overall, any type of eco-service or service you have in this area is gonna be combined with the natural environment. And that's why we really wanted to study this land and really figure out how important this is to people and what changes they're seeing. So our important ecosystem obviously is the marshes. So we are gonna have Thomas talk to you a little bit more about the marshes in the area, what makes them up, and why they're so special.
Thank you, Ella. All right. Now, we're just going to talk about some general definitions and terms that we use to describe these coastal wetlands. So, marshes can be defined by their periodical inundation, their flooded vegetation, as well as tidal influence whenever it comes to water movement. When we're looking specifically here at the, sorry about that. When we're looking specifically at the Currituck Sound, which is depicted in this picture right here, we're talking about brackish marshes. And brackish marshes get their name because they sit on a gradient between fresh and salt water. And as Ella was mentioning, the low salinity makes these places special. And we refer to that as an oligohaline environment. So these marshes bring about a number of different benefits to the area. One of these is its ability to protect against erosion with things like holding floodwater and acting as a barrier against boat wake activity, as well as heavy storms in the area. And it's also able to mitigate the impact of sea level rise. And it does that through this process called accretion, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. And another important thing to note about marshes is that they're a really diverse habitat. And this allows for migratory birds and other species to live in abundance in these areas. So I want you to look at this left image here. I want you to look at this left image here, and you notice these little sediments here are being deposited on the shoreline, as well as this kind of decayed matter here. And that's building up into what we call marsh accretion, which is going at a different rate from sea level rise. And another important thing to note is that we use cores to show the difference in this accretion, which we'll talk a little bit later more in detail. So what is the specific problem that we're looking at with our capstone? It's these marshes and their risk of experiencing changes to the vegetative community, as well as changes to the habitat. And this all in total will, we're looking at the potential of marsh loss. So I want you to look up here to this graph. In the top right, we see how sea level rise and erosion are contributing to this thing we call coastal squeeze, which is where it's forcing these marshes to have to migrate more inland, but that potential range for migration is being limited by the development further inland. And this means a lot of different things, but one of the things that we looked at is the change in the habitat quality. And we're looking specifically at this change in the habitat quality because it offers a risk of changing the vegetative community, and with that, its ability to filter out some of the water and offer other services. So next I'm going to pass things over to Addie, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the management of these risks and what people are doing in response. Here you go.
Thank you, Thomas, for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to talk about the management to some of these risks. As Thomas mentioned, boat wake causes some erosion in marshes. As you can see in the top picture, these are some waves created from boat wake, and you can see the little boat in the distance. But basically what this does is create this like water movement that slaps against the marsh, causing the erosion that you see in the bottom picture, which sort of takes away the underground biomass that undermines the marsh and causes it to decline. So how to manage boat wakes is through speed modifications and motor restrictions. And then another management tool is shoreline structures and sediment fill. I think a great example of this is the town of Duck Living Shoreline that's on the Currituck Sound. So for the sediment fill aspect, this was a previously eroding marsh, and they placed sediment and replanted vegetation so it could accrete to the rising water levels in the Currituck Sound. And then there's also shoreline structures of these breakwater sills that you see next to the vegetation that sort of reduce wave energy while also keeping the sediment fill in place. But the focus of our study is going to be the marsh management tool of controlled burning. So controlled burning can increase visibility. What I mean by that is hunters and fishers burn the dense vegetation that you see in this photo on the left, which is juncus or black needle rush. It can be very dense and hard to traverse to use these natural resources in the sound if they don't, if they don't burn this sort of dense vegetation. So to influence the controlled burning is also used to influence the vegetation composition. So that just basically means if there's certain plants that a land manager wants, they can do that through controlled burning. And it could also spur nutrient cycling. So that means that like with dead vegetation, there's these nutrients that are in them, and through burning, they can be then released into the soil and actually increase the growth of marsh vegetation, which sounds like sort of contradictory that you burn something and then it grows more, but that's how it works. So as Ella mentioned, we're going to be focusing on changes with a focus on controlled burning through two frameworks, human dimensions and natural science, and while also looking at the connections between these two. So some of the research questions for human dimensions are: how do stakeholders conceptualize the Currituck Sound? What changes in the Currituck Sound do stakeholders observe and experience? And how do stakeholders make sense of changes in the Currituck Sound? And then for the natural science side, we have: how do controlled burns impact the allocation of resources, such as carbon within marsh plants and soils? What are the impacts of controlled burning on the vegetation community in the marsh? And what are the implications for marsh resilience? As laid out by Ella, we're going to go through each of these frameworks, methods, and results, which I'll hand over to Valeria for the methods.
Thank you, Addie. So the human dimensions aspect of our research really helped us understand people's values, meanings, and perceptions of the Currituck Sound, and helped identify emerging themes of what people were thinking about the Currituck Sound. This aspect of our research is especially important to the broader concept that we introduced of using controlled burning as a management tool, because taking into account the human aspects of everything helps integrate the residents and the local community into the management process instead of just having management applied to them. So the human dimensions methods, we started out more qualitative, doing interviews, and then we moved on to doing more mental models and having an externalized view of how people conceptualize the sound. So who are the people that we interviewed? We interviewed 12 individuals who have experiences on the Currituck Sound through their lived experiences. And these people were recommended to us by other key stakeholders to have relevant knowledge to our research study. So demographically, all 12 of them were white, and 11 of 12 of them were males. They range in age from 30 to about 80 plus years old, and many of them have lived here for multiple generations. They also have jobs that include fishers, hunters, tourism, so that all builds their local ecological knowledge that they uniquely have. Conducting these interviews were one-on-one, and they were recorded so that we could later transcribe them for our data analysis process. They lasted on average about 54 minutes, but they ranged from 30 minutes to almost 2 hours. And they were semi-structured, meaning we followed an interview guide. And the interview guide has questions that follow some general topics so that everyone is asked the same type of questions. So as you can see here, some of the topics addressed in our interview guide were the changes that they see of the sound, some of their uses, the personal history, and then the interviewer had the discretion to ask follow-up questions. After the interviews were transcribed, we coded them, which just means that we read each transcription line by line and we pulled out any themes or ideas that popped out. So for example, if someone said, there's definitely 100 new neighborhoods between here and the Virginia line, we would code that as development. And then we compiled all those codes, standardized them to make a code book, and applied that to all of our transcripts and for our mental models. So this is an example of what the mental model method looks like. So this one is of sports. So if someone, this is how they might conceptualize and think of sports. So here you can see that there's the broader idea of sports, and they might connect that to different things like water sports, individual sports, team sports, and those lines show that association or connection between them. So in this case, for example, the water sport would be like the parent code or category that other individual codes may fall in. And then swimming and diving would be the individual codes or the children codes within the parent code. So we made these mental models for all of our different interviewees to externalize their perception and better understand their conceptualization. So Gloria's gonna go into the human dimension results and explain a little bit more about how we use these mental models.
Thank you, Valeria. So with the mental models combined with our interview transcripts, we're able to find the answers to our research questions. However, before we show our results, I first want to talk about examples of the mental models that we made based on the interviews. So this is an example of an extractive users. The first thing that we look at when we look at a mental model is what kind of stakeholder they are. So this one, when we were analyzing our transcripts, we found that it's actually pretty common for our interviewee to have more than one occupation. So this person, for example, they've done commercial fishing, hunt guiding, as well as other federal jobs. And the second thing that we look at, mental models is our legends. So our parent codes, as Valeria have introduced before. So there are a lot of categories such as natural environment, uses, connections, ecological, as well as human dimensions change, and management, dangers, marsh resilience, and future or uncertainty. And we're just gonna pick out a few things to look at right now. So the first thing that we might notice about the stakeholder is that they kind of tied livelihood with commercial fishing. Of course, this was their job, as well as economic changes and laws and regulations. And based on all these green codes, we found that this person had a lot to share about natural environment. And we look at the second example, which was also an extractive user, but this time this person is a generational resident of Currituck Sound, and their family has a really long history of hunting. And we can also find the same connection here. So economic changes, commercial fishing, livelihood, as well as laws and regulations. However, we know that even though they boasted commercial fishing or hunting, they actually share different things. So there are a lot of pinkish codes here. So these are a lot of things about control burning, and this person actually had a lot to say about control burning. But if we look back at the first model, this person didn't share anything about control burning. So even though both of them are extractive users, their opinion or knowledge about a certain subject really depend on their lived experience. And our final example here is a non-extractive user who is an owner of a water sports business. So this person didn't share anything about commercial fishing or economic changes at all, but they also mentioned laws and regulations. However, we knew that the previous users tied laws and regulations with economic changes or commercial fishing, while this person had a different perspective. They tied laws and regulations with conservation efforts. And they had a lot to share about natural environment and a lot of ecological changes that happen on the sound. So from these three examples, we can see that even though they are different or the same kind of users, there are still a lot of similarities or differences among all of them. And by reviewing all the mental models we made, as well as combining them with the transcripts, we're able to paint holistic picture of how stakeholders perceive the Currituck Sound. So yeah, let's look at our first research question, which is how do stakeholders conceptualize Currituck Sound? And the first thing that we found that is there's a really strong sense of pride for the community. Somebody told me that everybody living on the Sound is really proud of it, and there's an overall appreciation of wildlife. So it's an example of the western sandpiper that I took on the Sound, as well as an otter that we saw. We were on the Audubon sanctuary. There's also a picture of osprey, blue crabs, waterfowls, or ducks, and just a really beautiful sunset on the Sound. In addition to that, we found that different stakeholders conceptualized the Sound based on how they used it. So while commercial, recreational fishers and hunters characterize the Sound as aquatic and wildlife resources, those who run water sports business saw the Sound as a place for tourism. And for those who just participated in water sports such as kayaking or stand-up paddling, they viewed the Sound as a place of gathering and also a vehicle for recreation, because they tend to do these things with their family and friends and even pets, and that they all come together and contributed to the sense of community on the Sound. So when we ask our interviewees, how did you like the Sound? What's your impression on the Sound? Or what's your earliest memories of the Sound? They really told us a lot about their lived experience. So one resident told us that, well, Currituck Sound is basically a way of life, or for a lot of people. For me, it's relaxation, it's home, it's recreation. It's a place for meeting and just having great life. And somebody who worked in commercial fishing and hunting also told us, it's my work, it's the love of my life. That's all of it right there. I mean, I wake up every day to come out of here. I don't care about nothing else. I've been wanting to do it my whole life. I've done it my whole life. So you can really see from these quotes that living on the Sound for a long time, or even growing up on the Sound, has really shaped these people's way of living, and in return, that has told us how they conceptualize the Sound. And I'm gonna pass this to Carly to talk about our second research question.
All right. The next question that we asked is, what changes in Currituck Sound do stakeholders observe and experience? First, we found that there were changes in community and personal ties, and this was often related to ecological changes in the area. One interviewee said, "You sit there and you look at something you know will be gone, and you've had an attachment to it for your entire adult life. It's been a place you spent 100 days a year for 20 years. You spent thousands of days there and you watch it go away." And this quote kind of captures the sentiment of many of our interviewees who had deeply personal ties to the area. Almost all of them brought up memories or stories from their time in the Currituck Sound and then contrasted that to the community that they see today. We also found that there were changes in the natural environment, and these changes fell under 3 categories: water quality, habitat, and marsh loss. For water quality, this was mainly attributed to anthropogenic pollutants and runoff, as well as changes in salinity. And then these changes in water quality were then connected to wildlife population and health. Many interviewees noticed decreases in waterfowl populations, and one said, "The Sound really doesn't have any ducks compared to when I was young. When I was your age, this place had ducks. This place doesn't have anything anymore." And then this decrease in ducks was then often connected to marsh loss. Although not all interviewees brought up marsh loss directly, all of them either brought up erosion or rising water levels. And then finally, we noticed changes in uses and economic engines. One interviewee said that in the past, you hunted, you fished, and you farmed a little bit, and that was it. There was no industry down here. And really the only industry today is tourism. So all interviewees brought up an increase in population and then tied this to changes in economic engines, such as the increase of tourism. This increase in population also led to an increased cost of living, which is a negative impact of the changes of use in the Currituck Sound. And now Jane is going to talk a little bit about the implications of these changes.
So, how do stakeholders explain or make sense of these changes? Well, one way is through development. and specifically increased population and infrastructure. 50% of people that we interviewed connected development to changes in wildlife population and habitat, especially because of light pollution and its economic implications for important industries like duck hunting. Interviewers also brought up increased natural resource use by tourists for recreational activities like boating and jet skiing. They subsequently connected this to erosion due to the wake from the boats and the jet skis crashing onto the sound and increasing the process of erosion that they've observed over time. Finally, stakeholders also brought up changes in land use from farm area to recreational areas and connected it to decreased water quality due to runoff. This has implications for both recreational and commercial uses of the sound. Many interviewees also brought up specific infrastructure projects such as the Mid-Currituck Bridge, with one interviewee mentioning, well, now we're going to get more cars and stuff. Now where's the rubber and the gas and the oil go off the cars? It goes out in the sound. The more they do, the more detrimental it is. But besides development, interviewees also explained change through management, or in other words, the attempts to benefit nature through construction or laws and regulations. Many people that we interviewed had experience with controlled burns and connected it to vegetation changes. They mentioned greener and thicker vegetation as a result of controlled burns, so they subsequently viewed it favorably, generally. They perceived it as effective at increasing plant health, promoting wildlife habitat, and increasing their usability of the sounds and marshes. One interviewee mentioned, if it hasn't been burned, I mean, it can almost be hard to even get around in. This is just one example of how interviewees connected controlled burns, not just with ecological changes, but also with their ability to use and navigate the marsh and the sound's waters. So this is what they observed, and next Lily will talk to you about what we observed in our own research.
All right, we're gonna switch gears and start talking about the natural science portion of our research. So we just wanted to remind you what our natural science research questions were. So we wanted to look at how controlled burns impact the allocation of resources within marsh plants and soils, the impacts of controlled burning on the vegetation community of the marsh, and what the implications for marsh resilience are. So first I want to show you a map of the study sites that we used for our natural science portion. These were based off of historic data from the Audubon Society. So we, before we went out in the marsh, we picked 6 different sites to take samples from. We had 2 control sites over here on the east side. We had 2 occasional sites, one on the east and one up here on the west. And then we had 2 frequent sites also up on the west. So the control sites we there were no historical data of any burns happening. Our occasional sites were last burned in 2021, and then our frequent sites have data of being burned every year. So at each of these 6 different sites, we set up 3 different plots. So these plots were set up using this 1x1 meter grid, and we would place it down where we wanted to set up our plot. So our first plot was set at the first vegetated line at the shore. So we took a boat to each of these sites, and the first vegetated line, after we got off the boat, we would set up the plot, and that was our first plot. And then plots 2 and 3 were set up at 5-meter increments away from plot 1. So plot 2 was 5 meters away from plot 1, and plot 3 was 5 meters away from plot 2. And then at each of these different plots, we took various samples. So at each site, we did vegetative indices. So that included things like how many species were there, how many plants of each species were there, the height of the species, the diameter of the species, and like how healthy they were. So we took that data and used it for biodiversity indicators later. And then we also took above ground biomass samples that involved, we took 1/4 of each 1x1 meter plot, and we cut every plant that was in that 1/4 section at the root, bagged them, dried them, and then weighed them at the lab. And then we also took soil cores. We took 2 at each plot, and one of those cores were used for below ground biomass. So we cut the core up into 10-centimeter increments, and then we washed it through a sieve, which you can see over here. And then that allowed us to take all of the roots out that were in that core, and we sorted them by live and dead and used that for some of our biomass. And then we, with the other core we took at each site, we sampled a section from each 10-centimeter increment and burned them in a furnace. And that allowed us to look at the organic matter that was in that core. And then we also took surface and pore water samples. So at each plot, after we took the soil core, if there was any pore water in that core, we took a small sample of it. And we also took surface water samples that were directly off the boat after we docked it. And I'm now going to pass it to Veronica, who's going to tell you about some of our vegetative results.
Thank you, Lily. We found a lot of amazing things with our natural science results. And I'm going to kick it off by talking about our vegetative composition results. But before I do that, I want to orient you to this picture over here of some of us in the marsh. We're investigating the different plants that we found at our sites. But why did we do this? Plant communities can tell us a lot about the environmental conditions that they're found in. And as scientists, we can use botany to characterize the quality of a habitat. In wetlands, we have a lot of research indicating that there's a relationship between floristic quality indices and anthropogenic disturbances. Within our studies, we used 4 different indices to measure this. We looked at species richness, coefficient of conservatism, or C-value, floristic quality index, or FQI, and salinity tolerance. And using these 4 indices, we can compare our occasionally and frequently burned sites to our controlled sites, which again are pristine, unburned sites that are really high quality habitat. Looking at our first result, we measured species richness, which is a very simple biodiversity measurement that involves counting all the species in a plot. Up here I have just graphics of some of the very common and dominant species that we found. Our favorite was black needle rush, or Juncus romerianus. Through our study, we found that there was no statistically significant relationship between species richness and burn frequency, and generally we found low species richness at all of our plots, which is not very surprising. As Thomas mentioned earlier, we have a brackish marsh in the Currituck Sound, and there's not going to be very many species, which is why we looked at C-values. C-values are numerical values assigned to different plant species by the USDA, indicating how tolerant they are to human disturbances. So species with high C-values typically are very high quality habitat. Looking at our chart, we have C-value average weighted on our y-axis and then our burn frequency on the x-axis. Our study found that occasionally burned sites have the highest average C-value, meaning that they have very good habitats that support sensitive species. We also looked at our floristic quality index, which is a combination of C-values and species richness, and it kind of gives us a very comprehensive view of the habitat. We found that FQI at different sites, at different burn frequencies, had no statistically significant relationship. We also found that we had generally high FQIs, indicating that our study sites at occasional and frequent burns maintain a level of ecological quality that's comparable to our controlled sites, which are never burned and pretty high quality. We also finally looked at salinity tolerance. Salinity tolerance scores are very important for our study site because, again, they're brackish, they have salt. It's going to be very influential in determining how effective these sites are at adapting to environmental stressors like sea level rise and rising salinity levels. We found that occasionally burned sites had the highest scores compared to our controlled sites, and we hypothesized that this is because occasionally burned sites have a balance of disturbance periods and restoration periods that allows salt-tolerant species to move in. And to wrap up this section, I just want to show you guys some pictures of the habitat that we saw, because I realize that I've been talking a lot about them through data points and just numbers, but I have some pictures here showing our control site. Over here we have a lot of flowers, we have woody plants. Our occasional site, or occasionally burned sites, have very diverse species, are very high quality habitats, and our frequently burned sites, which interestingly have very tall plants, which Caitlin is going to talk about in our next section.
Thank you, Veronica. Veronica also made this lovely graphic, which I'm going to explain, just in talking about our biomass. So we collected above ground biomass samples, which are just everything you can see in the marsh with your naked eye. This is our shoot, and then our root is just everything below that holds the plant in place. And then these are just our pretty much raw biomass averages. Our first group is the above ground biomass, and our occasional sites had the highest mean here at 1,630. This is not significantly higher than our other groups, which is pretty much a good thing. We don't want our occasional sites to be much higher than our control sites, and we want everything to kind of return back to normal after these burns. And then for our living below ground biomass, we had a much higher root ratio here, and it's almost double what our occasional sites showed, which is really important, meaning that when sites are frequently burned, they're burning and then they're growing back much stronger. When these disturbances are caused, the root ratio increases and plants focus more on their roots, which is important for carbon storage as well. And then next, our total biomass is also highest at frequently burned sites and pretty significantly than occasional. And then one way we looked at our data was through root plus shoot ratios, which is just collecting all of our living and dead above and below ground biomass and then combining it together. To orient you to our graph, we have burn frequency on our x-axis and average total living and dead biomass on our y-axis. Our frequently burned sites were much higher here, and actually it was one of our most interesting findings because this came back as statistically significant. We ran a Kruskal-Wallis test, which is just a test for significance, and our p-value was 0.004, which meant that we could reject the null hypothesis that nothing is different between these burn frequencies, and there is something that's different, and that's likely the roots. There's much stronger root systems in our frequently burned sites. Another way that we manipulated our data was taking a root to shoot ratio, which is just the ratio of living and dead biomass. And we found here again our burn frequency. Oh no. Sorry, y'all. Our burn frequency on the x-axis and our root to shoot ratio on the y-axis. Here we have our frequently burned, which is much higher, but you can also see this really large error bar for our standard deviation, meaning that we need to continue this research. And these results aren't entirely conclusive, but this is something that land managers can look to when considering why they want to burn and what they want their marshes to look like. And then next, we just have the living root to shoot biomass. So our previous slide was alive and dead biomass. Sorry. And our living root to shoot biomass was pretty much identical to our total biomass. Our total biomass yielded a result of 20 for our mean, and then our living biomass was like 19.13. So the previous graph is almost identical to what this graph would look like. And then I just wanted to show you guys the roots. These roots are mostly living. They're pretty translucent and light in color. So when we were sorting our roots, we were putting them into bags, and we took them back to the lab to analyze them. And then moving forward, we looked at soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is a key indicator of soil health and fertility, and is also a good indicator of how carbon is being stored. And we have on our x-axis here all of our burn frequencies again, but we're moving inland this time. The blue is right when we step off the boat, plot 1, and then plot 2 is our red, and plot 3 is our green. And as we move inland, we can see, especially for the control and frequently burned sites, these sites have much less soil organic matter on the perimeter and then more as we move inland. But it's also important to note that at these sites, when we took the averages just across all 3 plots, we see a very similar ratio of means. The control yielded 0.29, the occasional 0.35, and the frequent 0.29. This is really important, meaning that not all of our soil organic matter is being burned off whenever we're burning, meaning that the marshes can continue to naturally accrete. We have a slightly higher occasional value, but nothing that was statistically significant. And then to further break down our organic matter, we took the top layer of soil, so just the 0 to 20 centimeter mark, and probably about where this person's hand ends is what we analyzed here. And this graph was nearly identical to the previous graph as well, and showed that most of the soil organic matter is in the surface layer. And soil organic matter is just like roots and nutrients, which makes sense. Our roots aren't reaching super low into the ground. And this is, again, interesting considering that burning may not get rid of all of this organic matter like we had originally thought. And then lastly, we analyzed water quality and we picked out 2 nutrients, our first one being phosphate, and our burn frequency is again on our x-axis, and then on our y-axis we have phosphate in micrograms per liter. And for our control and frequent sites, we see pretty similar levels across surface water and pore water. Our surface water is just the samples we took right off the boat, and then our pore water is the samples that we took from within the core. So when we took the core and pushed it into the ground and then pulled out the soil, there is sometimes water remaining, but this wasn't the case at all sites. Marshes that were more inundated had more water, and we were able to take samples there. It's important to consider the location of these marshes as well. Some of them are closer to shore, meaning that they might experience more runoff. And this could be why we see such a high jump for occasionally burned sites. Another reason is that marshes that the control and frequently burned could have stronger root systems, and they could be taking in more of these nutrients. Next we have ammonia, and this is another nutrient that's found in fertilizer. They both are, that's why they could be indicators that there's runoff in the area. And the same trend kind of is shown here. For occasionally burned sites, we see a much higher surface water concentration of ammonia, and this is a potential indicator of declining water quality, especially where our occasional sites are located. Next, Sarah's going to tie us in for all the human dimensions and natural science results.
Thank you, Caitlin. So we've made it to the conclusions. I'm going to try to tie together those 2 sides of our research. So we had our human dimensions and our natural science research. So I'm going to put those together. So for the most part, we did find that our interviewee observations matched, at least in some extent, our natural science findings. Those findings that matched up fell under a few key categories, and the first of these is water quality. So our interviewees made a very strong point of bringing up water quality changes throughout their life, throughout the time they've been on the Sound, and those changes mostly were composed of an increase in salinity and an increase in anthropogenic pollution. The anthropogenic pollution that they referenced was often fertilizer runoff, and we would see that in the form of excess nutrients in the water, whether that be nitrogen or phosphorus. Our natural science findings actually agreed with both of those. We saw changes in salinity tolerance of our plants, which indicates that there could be greater salinity occurring, and we found high concentrations of phosphate and ammonia in the surface water of our western side of the Sound sites. So phosphate and ammonia, as Caitlin brought up, are components of fertilizer, and that means that our interviewees were correct, one, in noticing the change and in identifying the cause. Our second key area where we found connections between the 2 was about controlled burning. So as Jane brought up way back, a lot of our interviewees had strong opinions about controlled burning. Many of them had experiences with it, and those that did had pretty positive reflections on them. They thought that the vegetation grew back greener and thicker, and with that, we assumed that meant it was a positive correlation. They also referenced seeing less erosion occurring at those sites. Our findings did actually confirm that to an extent. So they did find that there were positive effects in moderation. So we saw an increase in habitat quality, and we also saw an increase in biomass. However, there can be too much of a good thing. We're not saying go out and light everything on fire, because if you do that, we might actually see a decline in vegetation. If you don't give the marsh the chance to regrow, you can actually see more of it burn away and become more susceptible to erosion. And that leads me to our next point. So, marsh resilience was a big factor that we brought up. One thing we're very concerned with is marsh loss, and we're defining marsh resilience as the ability of a marsh to stay above water. So whether avoiding submergence or avoiding erosion, that marsh is not being lost, it's avoiding marsh loss. And our interviewees really agreed that that's a big problem. Many of them brought up seeing entire islands that they used to play on or fish from in their youth are now completely gone today. And the problem with that is, well, controlled burning, is that helpful or is it not? So a lot of them actually had very positive feelings toward controlled burning as a way of reducing marsh loss. One even said that controlled burning was holding the marsh together. And our natural science findings do, again, to an extent, support that. So we found that occasional burning can increase short-term resilience. The best indicator for that was the fact that our occasionally burned sites had greater biomass, and they had healthy vegetation regrowth. When we have healthy vegetation, when we have healthy soil and better soil structure and soil quality, we're able to reduce erosion and help protect those marshes. Again, though, if we're doing too much, we can actually burn away that organic matter and vegetation before it has the chance to regrow, and that actually makes us more susceptible to erosion. So those were some of our main conclusions we took away from the two sides of our research. Abby's going to now talk to you a bit about the limitations of our research and areas for future study.
Thank you, Sarah. So before we wrap up, we did want to discuss some limitations to our study. On the human dimensions side, we did have a lack of diversity amongst participants, both demographically and occupationally. So this would be a really great area to expand on in future research to get a more holistic view of how each stakeholder is conceptualizing the sound and the changes it's undergoing. Also, we did have 12 different interviewers for each interview. So this could have led to some inconsistencies in the general flow of each interview. On the natural science side of things, we did have a relatively small data set. We had 18 different plots across 6 sites. And further, we did not have any control sites on the west side of the sound. This is because all of the sites that had never been burned before were privately owned property. I don't know how well it would have gone over with the property owners if we had just marched over there and started digging holes and taking Juncus samples, so that's definitely something to consider as well. And with the water quality samples, the nutrients we measured that indicate water quality experience fluxes due to a multitude of factors. So this could be proximity to houses and septic tanks, the location on the sound, the time of year, or even just the weather that day. So this is something that should also be considered when looking at our data. Despite these limitations, we were able to draw some pretty interesting conclusions from our data. Particularly, we found that different burn frequencies have different benefits. So while frequently burning a site may be more beneficial for long-term marsh resilience, occasional burns may be better for short-term resilience and habitat quality. Additionally, as we derived from our human dimensions data, different groups of people may conduct controlled burns for a multitude of reasons. So moving forward, we really urge the continuation of adaptive management in the future. Marsh loss is an urgent issue, and it's not only affecting the Currituck Sound, but the broader Outer Banks region, and the negative impacts it's going to have on the local ecology and stakeholder livelihoods are only going to be made worse by climate change. We believe that it's really important to incorporate the connections between our ecological findings, stakeholder perceptions, and local ecological knowledge in future management strategies. Thank you so much for coming to our capstone presentation or for watching online. Thank you again to the Community Advisory Board and Robbie Fern. And thank you to Lindsay, Sean, and Linda. And now we would like to open the floor to any questions if you guys have them.
Okay, again, if you have questions, please let Lauren or I know, and we will bring a mic to you. Okay, thanks, Susan. Are you getting it?
That was amazing. Well done. Congratulations. Can somebody talk a little bit about fire intensity and how that may matter? By your faces, I feel like you don't like that question.
Yeah, I don't know that we necessarily considered much about fire intensity. We did discuss how burns may be carried out for different reasons, so that definitely plays a role. I'm sure that the hunters who are carrying out the burns are maybe doing it a little bit differently than marsh managers, but our main focus for this data was burn frequency, so that's definitely a really good gap that should be filled in the future. Thank you for bringing that up. We're gonna add some things.
I just had a little bit of information to add to Abby's answer. We did discuss this a little bit, but not in our presentation. We kind of talked about how fires spread a little bit more inland and don't really affect the coast as much of a marsh. That kind of had, it was kind of a limitation on our study because we found that distance actually plays a role in in conjunction with burn frequency on habitat, soil, all those things. So yeah.
So I guess, so my question is, so we have a lot of coastline up and down the entire United States and marshes. Did you all look at other states who have marshes other than North Carolina, Maryland, South Carolina? Do they do frequent burning, non-frequent burning to enhance their marshland just like is going on in Currituck?
We did look at our paper, some other papers that were studied burning in other states, like for other studies. I don't think it's something we really necessarily considered in our research, but we did look at other studies that were doing some burning, but I would say it's like not really a heavily studied area, and there definitely should be more studying in the future.
One thing that we did found that differs between states and locations is like the goal of doing controlled burns. In other areas that are more, I guess, more commonly have wildfires, a lot of controlled burning is done to prevent the severity of wildfires if they do break out, because it gets rid of the kind of litter and fuel that would light. So that's something that's a little different for Currituck. That's not as much the focus of doing controlled burns. But that's just one interesting thing we found, I guess.
Does the frequency of the burn change the mix of plants that you saw in some of the test areas?
Veronica and Ella spent a lot of time on this, so let me know if I'm wrong. But it seemed like, for the most part, plants were pretty much the same. I would say the woody plants were burnt off the most, if that's correct, but they were pretty similar across all plots.
I mean, yeah, Caitlin kind of got it. In terms of species richness, we found generally that there were the same amount of species, but there were different types of plants. So on sites that weren't burned, we had woody plants because those take a long time to develop. I'm not sure if that answers your question, or, okay, yeah.
Going back to the human dimension sides of things, in your research, did you find a history of indigenous land management practices pre-European colonization? Were they using burns as well?
Yeah, I would definitely say a limitation of some of our human dimensions research was a lack of indigenous voices. I think it just has to do with how we found interviewees and the short period of time that we had to conduct research. But I think that'd be a really great area for future research. We did read some literature about indigenous management of the land. If anyone has anything else to add to that.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to find records of indigenous practices just because of like the implications of colonialism. But when we were doing our literature review, I did find many sources about indigenous tribes using controlled burning as a way to kind of control the habitat, because as we learned when we came here, and I think Ella talked about this a little bit maybe, but the indigenous tribes did move to this island to hunt. So they were definitely utilizing practices like that to make this habitat better for them to hunt. But unfortunately, there's just not a lot of like concrete data on that.
So some of y'all are going into policy, and then I know we all hate regulations. Did anybody on the human side make recommendations of any kind of policies they wanted instituted that would preserve some of the quality of the Currituck Sound?
I don't know about specific policies, but I think the main thing we got from a lot of people is that they want this like contact with the people that live there. So a lot of times they kind of saw management as this big outer thing where the federal or state government is taking care of it and doesn't really know the people that live there. So I think the main thing we took away from this is that this local ecological knowledge and really just getting to know the area helps us to create better management strategies that will be more followed and will really like curtailed to the place that it is being managed.
And just to add on to that, from reading all the transcripts of our interviewees, as you would expect, there was a lot of diversity in perspectives about laws and regulations, and that oftentimes was related to how they use the sound. So for example, many of the commercial fishers and hunters were kind of anti-laws and regulations. They felt that it was limiting their ability to support themselves. Meanwhile, there were other interviewees that maybe were recreational users and took part in water sports, and they were more pro-regulations and conservation efforts because they value just more of seeing the wildlife and everything out on the sound. So I would say that it definitely differed a lot between stakeholders.
Great job on your presentation. That was really, really nice. I'm curious about, there's not very many studies that combine local ecological knowledge with natural science. So wondering what you all would say that you learned from the process of combining those two fields and whether you feel like they can enhance one another, or what you would recommend, I guess, to other people looking to combine those fields.
Talk on that. We did find it does take a lot of additional work to integrate those two sides of things, which I do believe is part of why we don't see it as much. But the thing is, if we're looking to use science as a way of shaping regulation and as a way of improving management, you have to be looking at both sides of things. Or at least we benefit a lot from looking at both sides of things. We saw very different results, but when we brought them together and when we pulled out what was important, it was extremely beneficial for us and for, hopefully, for Pine Island and that sort of thing. Anyone else?
I have a question from the online chat. You defined some areas as frequently burned versus occasionally burned. How often are the frequently burned sites burned? How often are the occasional sites burned? Looking at every 3 years, every 5 years, etc.
So I guess it kind of depends on like where you are, but for our specific study sites, our frequently burned sites were burned every year, and our occasionally burned sites were last burned 3 years ago.
Any additional questions? Job offers? Okay. Robbie, job offer? Okay.
Thanks. I've been really thinking about the research questions y'all sparked through this research because I'm at the Pine Island Sanctuary. So the areas that are frequently burned, from my lived experiences, are falling apart. And yet the data says that for longer term management, frequent burning may be better. So it's a really great area to dig down into, right? So as I was driving back from listening to all this research before, I started to wonder, is it a sediment supply issue? Are those areas not getting enough sediment? Is it a question of actually the plants are responding to the frequent burn by trying to survive and creating more below ground biomass, and at some point they're gonna tip over and then that whole area will collapse? So right now we're seeing more success in the frequently burned areas, whereas maybe occasionally burning is better. And we won't know until we do that research, and the work that these students have done have really set us up to dig in and figure out how best to manage these marshes in the Sound, and I'm very thankful for their work to do so.
Thank you so much for that. And that is such a great point. There are so many other factors that go into how a marsh survives. And thing that our wonderful advisor, Sean, mentioned is we only study the frequently burned marshes that are still there. So that's kind of one limit. But yeah, that's very true. There are just so many things that go into how a marsh survives. And yeah, I'm other people find in the future years of this research. So is everyone here. I think I speak for everyone when I say that.
Thank you, Ravi. I also just want to add that I think his perspective kind of speaks a lot about why we need to combine human dimensions and natural science. Why we need to combine human dimensions and natural science so much, because we have these people who have lived experiences and have certain ideas about what controlled burning might do, and then there's not much information out there on what they actually, there's not like data out there kind of quantifying this and proving this. And I also just want to add that some of our data is also just not very accurate. I don't want to say not accurate, but like we have a lot of like deviation within some of our bars. So there's a lot of factors that go into why we might be seeing some of these changes in marsh besides frequently burned. And I mean, it's kind of proven by just the deviations that we see in our charts and stuff. Yeah. She was referring to the error bars. Yeah, the error bars. Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah, not that we're not accurate. We're I trust ourselves.
I think another thing we mentioned was we don't experience lunar tides here. All of our tides are wind-driven, so we didn't consider wind at all in our study. And then additionally, boat wake. All of our sites were very different geographically, so this is something that we could continue to consider in future research.
Great. Well, thank you all again for coming to this presentation. Thank you to the students for giving a great presentation. And hopefully you'll join us back at Science on the Sound next month, and that you'll continue to follow the Outer Banks field site, and if we have any updates about the work that these students do in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.